First of all, I thanked Avishai for that introduction, which, as I expected, was on the limits of panegyric, and being a sensible human being, I will ignore it. I want my wife to think it's true, but you don't have to. It's an enormous honor and pleasure to be here. I already enjoyed the opening session. I probably won't particularly enjoy this session, but I expect to enjoy all the others very, very much. Now, my book is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, and the session has been translated into The Future of Democratic Capitalism. Now, the reason I chose my title is that I know there's a crisis, but I don't know what the future of democratic capitalism is. As you will see, it depends on what happens now. It depends on what happens in many countries across the world. It depends on how people respond to the pressures upon them. And it depends above all on what happens in the most important democracy in the world, the one that saved democracy in the 20th century, the one that we used to think of as the arsenal of democracy, the United States. And that will be, of course, a central part of my discussion. I'd like to start with thinking about what one needs for a stable democracy with a quotation. So this is the book, so far in English and a few other languages, not Lithuanian. I can't imagine there's anybody here who needs a translation, since I expect, as is true in many small open economies, your English is considerably better population-wise than it is in Britain. So I'm not in the least concerned about this. I want to start with what I think was the most exciting discovery I made intellectually in writing this book, in trying to encapsulate my view, what democracy is about. And I'll come to some of that later. And it's this quotation, and it is clear then that the best partnership in a state is the one which operates through the middle people, or the middle classes. And also that those states in which the middle class is large and stronger, if possible, than the other two together, by which the author meant the very rich and the poor, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run constitution. And you would think perhaps that this is a relatively recent comment, but it actually comes from the first great book on democracy and politics, written by one of the two founders of political theory and political science, Aristotle. So there is nothing very new in what I'm going to talk about. These are eternal truths. And the second quote I have, which is sort of a personal motto, which is also Greek. I should explain that I spent many years of my life studying classics before I descended to economics. And it is from the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, and the temple motto, the famous motto is mer negan, nothing in excess. And one way of thinking about this, if you are going to have a democracy, nobody wins. No victories are permanent. You have to accept limits. And that's very difficult for people to do. People want absolute power. People want absolute success. And then you cannot have a democracy. Now let me start with why this subject is so important to me. In 1937, since we're talking a bit about the history of this part of the world, but my parents were part of this. In 1937, my father left Vienna for England on his own. His immediate family managed, by a miracle, to escape to Palestine in 1939. But their wider family, his wider family, was stuck in Poland, and apart from one young woman, every one of them was killed in the Holocaust. In May 1940, my mother's father, a self-made Jewish fish merchant, hijacked a trawler in order to take his family to England as the German armies poured across the Dutch frontier. They had 4 days. He was one of 9. He asked his brothers and sisters to join him with their families. None came. Their families also all perished in the Holocaust. We are not exactly certain about the numbers, but essentially somewhere between 40 and 50 aunts, uncles, and cousins of my parents were slaughtered. And this was, of course, the result of the collapse of civilized order in Europe, of which people here know very much. There were many reasons for this collapse, but crucial among them was economic failure, particularly the Great Depression. That very clearly was what finally brought Hitler to power. And from it I concluded long ago that if people cannot gain a decent standard of living, a peaceful and democratic order becomes essentially impossible to sustain. Not completely impossible. There are circumstances in which it can be done. But if you lose hope, people lose hope in the system. And that's why the theme of my book, which I began as Donald Trump became president of the US and the Brexit campaign transformed my country for good, in my view, has seized me. I am not saying, and I'm not saying in this book, that what happened will happen again. History never repeats in this way. I'm saying that one must never assume the stability of a civilized democracy, not even the most powerful of them, not even that of the United States. So let me start briefly by talking a little bit about what my friend Larry Diamond, a very distinguished scholar at Stanford and the Hoover Institution, calls the democratic recession. In a liberal democracy, the only sort of democracy, in my view, that deserves the name democracy, that is a democracy characterized by individual political and civil rights, the rule of law, and respect for the rights of losers and the legitimacy of winners, fair elections determine who holds power. It's pretty simple. Attempts by a head of government or state to subvert the election or overturn the vote are simply treason. And yet that is beyond doubt. Read the indictment if you doubt it. I've been looking at it. That is what Donald Trump attempted both before and after the last presidential elections. He failed, of course. Some decent and brave people ensure that. But to this very day, Trump very clearly continues to hold the loyalty of his party's base and whether willingly or involuntarily or not, of nearly all its presidential candidates. And conservative stalwarts, real arch conservatives like Liz Cheney, have been defenestrated from the party, and her crime was stating that Trump's big lie, that the outcome of the election was a lie, is in fact what it is, a big lie. So the Republican Party, as it is today, one of the two main parties in the world's most powerful democracy, is simply no longer committed to the most fundamental of all democratic norms, fair and free elections. Yet how can any democracy survive if people think the only thing that matters is winning? Democracy at its basis is founded on pretty fundamental moral values. We are all citizens. We govern through debate. We argue honestly. We accept the outcome. With these values gone, what is left to decide politics, but violence. And Trump is, alas, far from alone. Freedom in the World, from the independent US watchdog Freedom House, which is published at the beginning of every year, has just reported an 18th consecutive year of decline in the health of liberal democracy worldwide. The democratic recession, noted by Larry Diamond more than 1.5 decades ago, is now closer to a democratic depression. This decline has occurred in all regions of the world, notably in fragile democracies that emerged in Central and Eastern Europe and all over many other parts of the world after the end of the Cold War. But most significantly, at least for me, and most dangerously, it is also observable in a number of core Western democracies, as I mentioned already, including the US. So that's where we are. Now let me talk a little bit about how our contemporary system of democratic capitalism was born. And this is obviously very simplistic. According to the polity, there's a very beautiful database, which unfortunately hasn't been updated recently, but it's a beautiful database which shows on certain criteria, which I can't explain, the proportion of the world's countries that could be viewed as reasonably democratic. Oh, sorry, what's happened here? I can see it here, but I can't see it there. Can somebody rescue the screen? Hello? Ah, no. I want to go back. Ah, sorry. There's something that, being the reactionary I am on these things, but when technology fails, I always feel so happy. It just reminds us they're not gods yet. God would not permit this. So, this is a remarkable, I'm starting this in 1870. It shows basically what proportion of the world's countries, it ignores the fact that, of course, many were parts of empires, from 1870 to 2010 were democracies. And that's the brown line. And I would point out that in 1800, there wasn't one in the world that could plausibly be regarded as democracy. There was a big boom in democracy in the late 19th century, reaching a peak just before the First World War. It then fell just after the First World War. Then it collapsed to the nadir during the Second World War, which is I'm talking about, a recovery after the war, and then this huge explosion in democracy in the last 35, 40 years, starting about 1980 to 2010, and then a decline, which unfortunately I can't show you. The second thing this chart shows you is the relationship of this with the simplest measure of the global market economy, the ratio of world trade to GDP, which the other two lines show. And what they show is that there's a very strong relationship. I discuss this at length in the book. The basic point is when economies are booming, people are confident in the growth of economies, globalization seems to be working, then people are prepared to risk, along with economic liberalism, political liberalism. It's not a perfect correlation, but it is very, very visible. So let's think about that relationship. Why did this happen? Why did we move into a world from which we are now declining somewhat, in which democracy, a system that didn't exist effectively in the world a little over 2 centuries ago, became so significant? It's worth remembering that the normal way to structure human economies and politics in complex hierarchical society has been very simple. Power marries wealth, and wealth marries power. The most powerful people in society were the richest, and vice versa. absolute monarchs effectively owned absolutely everything. So why then did we move towards democracy at all? And the answer lies, I argue, with the marriage between these two very different partners, a liberal economy and a democratic polity. Market capitalism and democracy are, in my view, complementary opposites. And like most good marriages, that's part of what makes them work. The market economy and universal suffrage democracy reject the idea of ascribed hereditary status. You don't become a prime minister because your father was. That's quite a revolutionary idea. I assume that the Grand Dukes of Lithuania, like all the other Grand Dukes, became Grand Dukes because their father was a Grand Duke. And the first Grand Duke was presumably, like in every other country I know of, simply the most successful brigand of the time. But you can correct that if I'm wrong. In market economies and universal suffrage democracies, we embrace the idea, in addition, that people are entitled to decide important things for themselves. Status, ascribed status, doesn't really matter. Market capitalism rests on ideals of free labor, individual effort, reward for merit, and the rule of law. Democracy rests on ideals of free discussion and debate among citizens when making those laws. This is the marriage of the private and public realms within a liberal, democratic, capitalist society. But historically, the market economy, of course, also worked. It brought profound economic transformation, painful and difficult, but also rising prosperity, urbanization, the demand and need for a more educated workforce, a powerful engine of democracy, a newly organized working class, and as a result of all this, opportunities for positive sum politics. I noted in the previous discussion the comment that we would need growth for a stable democracy, and I believe that is true. Democracies rest on the existence of an economically independent citizenry. That was Aristotle's brilliant point. A fully socialist society, as you surely know far, far better than I do here in Lithuania, is inevitably a dictatorship, since the ownership of productive assets is vested by definition in the state. In the absence of coordination through competitive markets, the state is then responsible for the allocation of those valuable resources, and those in control of the state control everything, and therefore democracy is impossible. Markets protect democratic politics from such an excessive concentration of political power. But democratic politics also protect markets from an excessive concentration of economic power. And one of the most extraordinary exemplars of that is the great movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the US to attack the great monopoly trusts of that era. This, then, is how the market economy and liberal democracy are complementary. Yet they are also opposites. Capitalism is naturally cosmopolitan. The democratic state is territorial. The market is the domain of exit. Democracy, that of voice. The market economy tends naturally towards the inegalitarian. Democracy is essentially egalitarian, the principle of one person, one vote. For all these reasons, profound tensions between capitalism and democracy will inevitably emerge. But above all, if the economy fails to serve the interests of the majority, or is seen to fail to serve the interests of the majority, the sense of shared citizenship will fray, and populist demagogues will emerge. Such populism is not necessarily lethal for democracy, so long as it takes a form of a justified suspicion of elites. but too often it transforms into hostility to pluralism itself. And without the acceptance of pluralism, there can be no democracy at all. And what then happens is democracy is transformed into a plebiscitary dictatorship, in which the dictator insists, and this is more or less exactly the language that many of our recent rulers have been using, including Mr. Trump, is that the people are me. I am the people. Alternatively, the concentration of wealth can lead to plutocracy, as wealth is once again transmuted back into political power. Indeed, it is quite likely to have both predatory autocracy and corrupt plutocracy in uneasy tension. In some, democracy and the market are married to each other, but it is a difficult marriage. Now let me look at where the democracies are now. Large rises in inequality and the deteriorating prospects of the old, respectable working and middle classes in core democracies have eroded the foundations of democracy. The fear of downward mobility has created status anxiety and political cynicism. These motivations of fears have then been diverted by propagandists into cultural and racial resentments, especially in ethnically diverse societies. This has many echoes from the past. It is not new. It happened in the interwar Europe, and of course it has long been the foundation of the political culture of the American South. The emergence of the new media have, in my view, facilitated these trends, but I think they did not create them. A big question, of course, is what happened to create this status anxiety, especially in so many countries, in people who did not go to college. In the long run, in my view, the important phenomena have been economic. Not only economic, but they are very important. Deindustrialization, rising inequality, falling productivity growth, and finally, financial instability and slowing economic growth, especially after the Great Recession. Let me just indicate one. This chart shows deindustrialization in the major industrial economies, and you can see in every one there has been a massive decline in the proportion of people working in employment in industry. And that's been determined predominantly not by trade, but by massive productivity shifts. A colossal shift against the old industrial working class, whose resentment and fears drive a lot of what is now going on in our countries. Now, Raghuram Rajan, a very distinguished economist at Chicago University, argued some years ago that easy credit papered over all these terrible trends. But that blew up in the financial crisis, which turned out to be a turning point economically and politically. I personally argue in my book that the shock of the financial crisis in the Western world, and particularly in the US and UK, was very profound. It shook trust in the wisdom and probity of those running the affected countries' financial, economic, and political systems. Most policy mistakes in economics are pretty invisible to the bulk of the public, but they could not possibly fail to realize that those in charge had failed to recognize the risks they allowed the financial sector to run or to curb them. Many members of the public then came to believe that these failings were the result not just of stupidity, but of the intellectual and moral corruption of decision makers and opinion formers. And they also, even worse, saw the resources of the state used to rescue both banks and bankers, the architects as they saw it of the disaster, while they suffered large losses and unemployment. And they also saw that while financial institutions were forced to pay huge fines, essentially nobody was punished for what happened. And not least, and this is the last chart I will show, I'm going to omit that one because of lack of time. There were massive reductions in real incomes. So this is the deviation of GDP per head from the 1990 to 2000 trend among the major developed countries, the same countries as I showed before. This goes up to 2021, but really 2020 is more interesting. I think COVID messed it up. We're still not completely through that period. The essential point is, I'll just focus on the US because I can't go, that by 2021, GDP per head in the US was 22% below what it would have been if the pre-crisis trend had continued. This is just a massive decline. It's like a Great Depression in terms of relative real incomes. And by the way, in the UK, Spain and Italy, as you will see, it is even worse. So let me turn now, I'm getting to the end, on democratic capitalism in today's world. My friend Branko Milanovic has argued that capitalism is now alone. It has won. But the crucial question for us, I think, particularly here, but across the whole Western world, is what sort of capitalism has won? Is it what Milanovic calls liberal capitalism, and I'm calling democratic capitalism? Or is it what he calls political capitalism, and I would simply call authoritarian capitalism? And what is authoritarian capitalism? And is it a credible adversary alternative to democratic capitalism? There are in fact two forms of authoritarian capitalism. The most common version derives from a hostile taker of democracies from within. The would-be autocrat eats out democracy. Usually it's always a he, starts as a populist demagogue. Features of such regimes then include a narrow circle of trusted and obedient servants loyal to the despot, the promotion and reliance of members of the family deemed most loyal, and officials in the power ministries, the army, the police, the Department of Justice, and so forth, who are personally loyal to the leader. Plutocrats in such a regime may find it necessary to support the gangster in charge. Ultimately, however, they too only survive as his cronies. The other challenger is bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism, the Chinese system. A communist bureaucracy operating a capitalist economy can, it appears, be self-disciplined, long-sighted, technocratic, and rational. Even so, this form of capitalism also suffers from the classic vices of authoritarianism. Just look at China today. In particular, the tendencies towards corruption and crony capitalisms. These failings damage both the economy and its political legitimacy. This system is indeed a significant challenger to Western democratic capitalism, but I believe that ultimately it will fail. Autocracies are always ultimately bad systems, and above all because they do not have a structure of accountability. They do not have open debate. They cannot ensure the peaceful transfer of power, and they tend towards unbridled corruption. Indeed, corruption too often becomes the system because it's the only way anything can happen. Moreover, we should remember liberal democracy has come through many challenges over the past century. And above all, for me, and I hope and assume for you, it is the right system. It rests on the magnificent belief in the rights of people to make up their own minds and lead lives as they choose within societies whose joint decisions are taken with the consent of the governed. So to conclude, the renewal of democracy and capitalism must be animated but by a simple but overwhelming idea, that of shared citizenship. If democracy is to work, we must not think of ourselves only as consumers, workers, business owners, savers, or investors. We must think of ourselves as citizens. And citizenship has three core aspects: loyalty to democratic, political, and legal institutions, and the values of open debate and mutual tolerance that underpin them, concern for the ability of our fellow citizens to live a fulfilling life, and the desire to create an economy that allows all citizens hope of a better future. I'd just like to conclude by pointing out one very personal aspect of why democracy still works. Not so long ago, the UK had Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss as prime ministers. One was a fraud, the other was a fanatic. They were both got rid of peacefully. Contrast this with the fates of Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. Both are brutal dictators, and both are manifestly incompetent or worse. Is there any way of getting rid of them? None short of mass violence. And that is the difference. It is the difference between rule by consent and rule by coercion. It is the duty of all of us to ensure that our hard-won democracies, that 2.5 century-long battle I described, do not fail. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Please take a seat. And I'll be glad to continue a discussion on how democracies still work. But you will not disagree, as I understood from your presentation, that many democracies are becoming diluted. United States, Israel, closer to us, Poland and Hungary, already becoming only partially democracies and are dominated by autocrats or autocratic parties. And you have illustrated that GDP per capita has deviated in some countries from the pre-global financial crisis trend, and in some countries that has contributed to unhappiness of the population and the strength of the populists. But if you look at Poland and Hungary, I cannot tell you the exact figures on their economies, but in Lithuania, when I was graduating from the secondary school, the average wage in Lithuania was 240 euros. Now it is 5 times larger. Even adjusted for price increases, it's almost 4 times larger. The purchasing power has increased that much. When Lithuania was joining European Union, the absolute poverty was 33%. 1 in 3 were in absolute poverty, lacking money for necessities. Today, poverty is down to 6%, barely above EU average. And I think similar trends in terms of economic prosperity and growth have been witnessed in Poland and in Hungary. And on top of that, we have seen even a decline in income inequality. Yet, we see a rise of populists and autocratic regimes, clear erosion of democracy. How does that happen in these countries? And should we be afraid that this will happen as well in Lithuania?
I think that's a very profound question. So I, in my book, and I admit it, focused mainly on the countries that had what appeared to be consolidated democracies, very, very long established democracies. And I think, to my mind, it is pretty clear that there have been very substantial groups of people who feel that they have been both absolutely and even more relatively losers in the economic race. And this is linked, in my book I discuss it, but I didn't have time now, with many of these people also feeling that they are cultural losers. It sort of goes together, that as their economic position has declined, so has their cultural position declined. And that's a complicated story which is linked partly to the transformation of the universities and so forth. I don't regard myself as sufficiently expert to comment on precisely what's been going on in, I think, the most important cases, to my mind, are Hungary and Poland, and obviously it's not universal. But my hypothesis would be that there are 2 or 3 related facts. Well, first of all, economic shocks did play a role, certainly in Hungary. The timing of Orban's coming to power was very closely aligned with the financial crisis, which was clearly a very big shock in that case. The mobilization of protest, or a lot of the protest, and you can correct me on this because I'm not an expert, does seem to be coming from groups who feel that they have been significant relative losers in this rush to modernity, transformation, cultural change, and so forth. And finally, and this is a hypothesis which I don't feel strong enough to be completely confident about, but I think might be an element, it's a hypothesis, which is that by joining Europe and being catapulted from autocracy into democracy, these countries, and the one I visited most is Poland, were catapulted not only into a new economy and new economic system, but into a completely different cultural and political milieu, including profound transformations which had evolved rather slowly in the West, of the position of women, views on gender and all the rest of it. And there may be a real, quote unquote, shock of the new going on in countries that have moved from one completely different cultural milieu to another. And that would suggest that culture plays quite an important part in this, but I'm not expert enough to say much more on that.
But I would agree with your hypothesis that it's not only economic factors that are driving these strong divisions within the society, even though everybody is better off and wealthier and can afford more. But these cultural changes that you have mentioned leave a seemingly large share of population unhappy, unwilling to protest, and choose fringe political parties that can be very dangerous, as we have seen in Poland and Hungary and in some other places around the world. But getting back to economic factors, you illustrated with another chart quite clearly that in many liberal democratic Western countries, the share of employment in manufacturing companies has contracted dramatically over the past 30, 40 years. That, of course, was partially due to globalization, but partially also due to the fact that we consume and produce more services. So there was a shift in employment. But I was just want to clarify, 20 years ago you wrote a book that globalization works. Would you disagree with that thesis now?
That's a very good question. So this is I have a lot in my book about globalization. I think the evidence is that trade has played a relatively small part in and I mean, this is serious, and I've done quite a lot of analysis of that, in the shift in relative income distribution or in industrial employment. One of my favorite statistics there is that the level is different, that the decline in the proportion of the labor force working in industry in Germany, which has a colossal surplus and sustained it throughout, in the which the globalization are allowed it to do, is actually bigger than in the US. So that's true, and that's true more general. There's no correlation between openness to trade and either the rise in inequality in a society. The US is the most closed of all the developed countries and has had far and away the biggest rise in inequality. And similarly, in terms of employment shares in manufacturing, it's not very closely correlated. Obviously, if you've got a huge trade surplus, your share will be a bit bigger, but it's actually falling even faster. And the main driver is productivity growth. And if you do start looking at, well, what is the driver of the big shifts in income distribution, there are basically two that stand out. Skill bias technical change, which is overwhelming in this period. Basically, the increased demand for skilled graduates vis-a-vis people without graduate qualifications, and the enormous rise in incomes at the very top of the income distribution. That's the dominant factor. Trade is relatively insignificant. That's the first key point. The second point is, and I think that's particularly relevant for the US, is they basically decided to do nothing. In a welfare state, we have some systems for cushioning the shock. But in fact, when factories disappeared, they did absolutely nothing because all the policy instruments the US used to have to deal with trade adjustment were closed down. So I think that was completely unnecessary. And finally, I don't actually think that most of the industries that the US lost are recuperable. Because they basically lost comparative advantage on a really extraordinary scale in these activities. And that's very interestingly fits with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously misnamed, because they're not trying to create the old industries, they're trying to create completely new ones, which is very sensible. So, and then on the really big point, which I suppose is, we might say, I shouldn't make this remark, but I will anyway, is that the opening of trade led across the world to some completely transformative life changes in countries like China, India, Southeast Asia, none of which would have happened without trade opening. So since I think, and my book on globalization was about trade, not about other aspects, I do actually think that controls on capital flows might be quite a useful idea. I do discuss that. But if for these reasons, my view tends to be that trade worked pretty well as I had hoped it would for developing countries, which was the main focus of that book. It was nowhere near the dominant reason for the economic problems of the working classes in our countries, and it's a fraud when they pretend it is. Donald Trump imposed all these tariffs, didn't make any difference. So my view is that the reason we focus on trade is because that way we can blame foreigners. And the predominant problem wasn't foreigners, it was our failures of our own policies.
Since you touch upon IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically industrial policy, subsidizing local manufacturing industries at the expense of allies in Europe, in other Western countries, I'll draw comparisons to the 30s and the Depression, which also was economic problems were amplified by the protectionist policy. So this is a little bit similar. And we know, and you clearly illustrated what these policies have led to: strengthening of the nationalist parties, the rise of the Nazis in Germany, and so on and so on. So very briefly, what is your view on this industrial policy? Does that make potentially US society less unequal and makes stronger democracy, or quite the opposite?
So, my answer is, do you want the 15-minute answer or the 20-minute answer? So I will do it as quickly as possible. I've written this. So first, I expect that in the main aim of these policies, which is to create permanent, competitive, large-scale new industries which are technologically dynamic and world-leading, in most cases is going to fail. That's my guess, and that's consistent with a lot of American economists who've looked at this. That's point one. So I'm not wildly keen on. Second, it doesn't compare, clearly doesn't compare in scale and impact with the protection of the 30s, which was just crazy. Now, what Trump is now talking about, if he comes back, would move in that direction. A massive overall increase in the tariff level. It would be, I think he's proposing something like a 5-fold increase in the average US tariff. That would make a mess. My God, it would. But that's not where we are now. Third, there are two other arguments for this policy. One was put forward to me by a very dear friend who died many years ago, an Australian economist called Richard Snake. It was, one advantage of subsidies over tariffs is the costs appear in the budget. The real problem with tariffs is it's a concealed tax on consumers transferred to producers. They don't realize they're being taxed. This way, every time they pay this subsidy, it's going to be visible. And if you look at the US fiscal position, this is not going to survive, not in the long run. It's really very difficult fiscal position. And the other argument for it is if you can't introduce sensible environmental policies, obviously we need a carbon tax. This is, and this is Paul Krugman's argument, the second best, or third best, or fourth best. It's better than doing nothing if the end is to revolutionize at least the electric system. So for this reason, I'm not very keen on all this, but it could be worse, and it might yet become so.
Before we get too gloomy, which is inevitable when two economists...
I'm a cheerful economist.
Yeah. Couldn't tell that, but thanks for...
It can only get better now.
Let's get back to the idea that you briefly mentioned, that part of the undemocratic forces are amplified and enabled by the new media and social networks, where anybody can freely express their propaganda, their biased thoughts, their lies, and they do that extensively. And what I also notice here in this region and in Lithuania is that the most vile and dangerous politicians, or the politicians wannabe, one of their strongest arguments is that the press, the traditional media, is lying or not telling the truth. And I think this was invented by
Adolf Hitler.
Adolf Hitler, yes.
Lügenpresse.
And this is very strong. And for me, this is the best indicator how vile and bad the person is. If he says that the media, the traditional media, is not telling the truth, it is telling me the truth about that particular person. But the role of social...
I would have to agree, wouldn't I?
But do you have a view on, should there be some sort of, maybe not censorship, but there's a, I think, a lively debate on how social networks should take a role in what they allow to publish and what kind of lies they allow to spread on the social media?
I have three reactions, and I'll do them because I think we're minus time. First of all, it's true. So there's clearly a problem. There's no doubt about it. We have created, as I say in my book, a perfect machine for spreading disinformation. And this has never existed before. So that's pretty scary. Second, I think that it's still more a symptom. It's as much a symptom as a cause. When people lose confidence in elites, they become willing to listen to any garbage they get. I think the former comes before the latter. So that to some degree, the willingness to embrace idiot conspiracy theories is a result of unhappiness and suspicion of ordinary people, of the elites. So it's a symptom. And in societies where people feel things are working quite well, it probably would be much less. The third point is, I think it's very, very important to us, to where we can, to preserve public service broadcasters and consider how they should work. And finally, I do think regulation has to be considered, particularly in the way algorithms work. The problem is, however, that the people who run these businesses are always going to be many, many years, certainly months, and probably years ahead of the regulators. And so I don't know whether this is containable. But if you asked me if I were a dictator, which of course I don't want to be because I'm a Democrat, and I could close down all the social media in the world, I'd be very happy. But I would certainly want to close down, and this is quite serious, the legal access of minors to social media, where I think the damage seems to me really damaging. There shouldn't be people who are minors, and that means that the social media have to know who is using this, and I don't see why IT technology should not allow them to do that.
Thank you. The key takeaway from this is independent, professional, national broadcaster. Thank God we still have that. Thank you. I was having so much fun. I forgot to watch the time, but thank God that you did. Thank you, Mr. Wolf.